name is Kim Morris. I'm the project coordinator of a nonprofit called Riverkeepers in Fargo, North Dakota. Rivers connect us, and they need to be advocated for. In our area, we have a beautiful muddy river that's formed at the confluence of the Boydesue and Ottertail rivers in Breckenridge, Minnesota. It flows north along the North Dakota and Minnesota border into Lake Winnipeg in Canada. Along this 545-mile journey, you find Fargo, North Dakota, and Moorhead, Minnesota. The Red River flows right through these two cities and plays an important role in sustaining and defining them. We face challenges from seasonal flooding, but the Red River is also a main source of drinking water and for creating opportunities for recreation and bringing people together. It's an incredibly important resource that we've learned to invest in and take care of. Making meaningful connections in a community is one way to invest in a natural resource like a river. We will use the Community Capitals Framework as a way to look at how taking care of a river has benefited the Fargo-Moorhead area and how other capitals have spiraled up. Like many communities, the Fargo-Moorhead area has had a continually evolving relationship with the Red River, and that relationship impacts both the health of the Red River and our quality of life. Today, we'll gain some perspective by seeing how that relationship has shifted by looking at our recent history. We're going to first hear from Mark Peel, an archivist for the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, a nonprofit dedicated to promoting local history in Clay County.
Well, hello, my name is Mark Peel. I'm the archivist for the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County. We're located in Moorhead, Minnesota, in the M-Kump Center, right on the banks of the Red River. The river is extremely important to Fargo and Moorhead. The only reason that Fargo and Moorhead are where they are is just because this happened to be the place where the Northern Pacific Railway, the first railroad to reach the Red River Valley, crossed the Red River back in 1871-72. If they had crossed a few miles north of town or a few miles south of town, that's where the cities would be today, but they crossed here. And the reason for that was until the railroad got here, there was no Fargo, North Dakota, there was no Moorhead, Minnesota, it was open prairie around here. But everybody knew that wherever the railroad crossed the Red River, major cities would develop. And the reason for that is because it's a water source. Now, those are pretty limited here in the Red River Valley. And the river is still our primary source of water here in the Red River Valley. And unfortunately, water is something that's very easy to take for granted and overlook. And I think that's something that the Fargo-Moorhead community over the years has been somewhat guilty of. First type of recreation is probably the most obvious winter one, and that's skating on the Red River. These kids are skating on the Red here in early 1920s. That's about when hockey started to become popular in this part of the country. Recreational skating, always really important around here. But there are a couple of other recreational methods in the winter that most people, even in this area, are not all that familiar with. And one of them is racing horses on the frozen river. In the early 20th century, late 19th century, racing horses in one-horse open sleighs were extremely popular entertainment. Just west of the M-Kump Center, there's a quarter-mile track that was laid out. It's very popular. Most Saturday afternoons, there'll be huge crowds lining the banks, sitting in bleachers, and not only watching the horses, but betting on these races. I've read $500-600 bets riding on a single race around 1900. That was an awful lot of money. And ski jumping as well. You know, we don't have many hills here in the Fargo-Moorhead area, so if people want to ski jump, they have to build their own hills. This is the Dovry Ski Club's ski jump in what's now North Moorhead. It was a bunch of Concordia College students that got together. And in late 1922, they built the scaffold, 66-foot high scaffold for ski jumping right on the banks of the Red River. This wasn't big enough for them, so a few years later, they added another 25 feet to the top of this. That wasn't big enough for them. So in the mid-1930s, they built this behemoth up here on the Fargo side of the Red River, up in what's now Trollwood Park in North Fargo. This ski jump was 168 feet high. It was the tallest ski jump of its kind in the country at the time. Ski jumpers would slide down this thing. You'd be doing 60, 70 miles an hour when they hit the bottom of it. And it was really pretty exciting entertainment. And it was used throughout the 1930s, but in the early 1940s, a lot of the jumpers went off to fight in World War II, into the service. In 1942, The civil air authorities made them tear it down. They were concerned that planes flying into nearby Hector Airport might run into this thing. So they tore it down in 1942, and that was the end of ski jumping in this area. The fishing on the Red, extremely popular entertainment. This picture is taken around 1905. This gentleman's got a couple of lines out there in the river. If this guy had his choice of fish to catch, you'd probably be interested in catching walleyes. There's tremendous walleye fishing in the Red River, but especially catfish, channel catfish. Even a lame-o like me can catch big catfish in the Red River. I caught this 35-pound catfish north of Moorhead a few years ago. In Fisherman Magazine, international publication, says that the Red River of the North is the single best place in the world to catch trophy channel catfish. They grow huge here, and the further north you go on the river, the bigger they get. Scores of kids would be down there swimming in the Red River. It's a relatively clean part of the river. So they approached the city, and in 1932, the city of Moorhead built this swimming area for kids. They built a diving platform. They got a local power company to donate some poles, and they had a rope swing. And it was really a very popular place for quite a long time down there on the end of 6th Avenue South. But there were a number of commercial outfits as well. The longest lived and most famous was owned by a fellow named Frank Domer on the Moorhead side of the river at the end of 4th Avenue South. He had a little gasoline-powered launch called the Roanoke that he rented out to church groups and school groups. They'd take it upstream for a picnic and back. He rented out canoes and boats there for many years, for 42 years. In 1959, when he retired, the Fargo Forum local newspaper interviewed Domer, and he said that many people had come back and told him that their marriages had gotten started in date in one of his canoes. Apparently it was a good place to take a girlfriend or a boyfriend.
The river was once a source for many different community activities, many of which are different from how we use the river today. But over the decades, there came a shift in the attitude and behavior towards the Red River. And that shift presents a challenge when it comes to advocating for the Red River.
In the 1930s, things were changing, and people's attitudes about the river began to change. And one of the main things, of course, was the drought in the 1930s, the early 30s. This picture was taken in 1936, an extremely dry year. This gentleman was walking across the Red River in downtown Fargo Moorhead on a couple of planks. 1934, 1936, almost no rain fell at all. And for hundreds of days at a stretch, the only flowage across the dams was raw sewage. And it became a stinking, horrific mess. This is the North Dam. They were designed a little differently. The water flows across this steep incline here, tries to go downstream, but it can't, so it's forced up to the surface. And this recirculating current that was created around here could capture people and drown them. The dams became extremely dangerous places on the Red River. The rest of the river is not that much more dangerous than any of the lakes that we have in Minnesota. But in the 1930s, with these new style of dams, these low-head dams as they were called, these spots on the river became extremely dangerous. The Moorhead Junior Chamber of Commerce, the JCs, were just getting established here in Moorhead, and they needed a community service project, and they seized on river safety. One of the things they did was to hold a contest for little kids to submit slogans to scare their fellow children away from the river, to keep them away from it. There were over 1,000 submissions. One little girl from Moorhead came up with the slogan, "Taking chances doesn't pay. The river is dangerous night and day." And they put this all over the place, in advertisements in newspapers, up on the screen before movies were shown. The JCs had hundreds of signs printed up, and they stationed them along the river every few hundred feet. They got the Moorhead and Fargo Parks departments to develop diversion programs so kids could recreate away from the river. They didn't have to go down to the river to recreate in it. For generations in Fargo and Moorhead, kids got the lesson that the river was a dangerous and nasty place that you had to be avoided. And it was very, very effective. In 1943, for the first time in nearly 50 years, a major flood struck Fargo and Moorhead. And people have become complacent about flooding on the Red River, and they were really taken by surprise in 1943 by this flood. And people started to think of the river as a dangerous, nasty place that couldn't be trusted.
While the public questioned the safety of the Red River, we also turned our backs to the Red due to the annual flooding of the region. Looking at why our area floods offers an explanation.
I'm Don Schwert. I'm a retired geologist from North Dakota State University in Fargo. I arrived in Fargo about 43 years ago and taught at NDSU for 37 years. My specialty at NDSU was on superficial geology and environmental geology. To understand the geology of the Red River, we have to understand a little bit about the geology of the conditions before the Red River began to exist. The area of Fargo Moorhead and on up to Grand Forks, East Grand Forks, and on up to Winnipeg was once occupied by Glacier Lake Agassiz, a gigantic glacially dammed lake that was here, at least in the region of the Fargo Moorhead area, up until about 10,000 years ago, and then the lake drained away. And so to think about it, this river, which we see today, didn't exist until, the lake could drain away 10,000 years ago. And it's really interesting because we normally think about the ages of the rivers of the world in terms of millions of years, or tens of millions of years, or hundreds of millions of years. But here's this little river that we know began to flow, about 10,000 years ago. When Lake Agassiz drained, it exposed this landscape underlain by clays, about 100 feet of clay here in the Fargo Moorhead region. And those clays began to subside, they began to settle, so that there was a slight depression towards the middle of what we call the Red River Valley. So then it began to rain and there was snow melt, and we have then the beginnings of the Red River to the north. And this little river has had a tough time over those 10,000 years in trying to develop its valley. You think about what is one of the most difficult particles for a river to erode, and it's clay. Yet here is this river flowing across one of the flattest landscapes on earth that is trying to carve its valley through clay. And so over the last 10,000 years, it's carved a valley, but the valley is not very wide and it's not very deep. Here in the Fargo Moorhead region, we could measure the width of the valley in terms of 100 meters, 150 meters. So then at times of flood, waters come in and they quickly fill up this little valley that the Red River has been able to carve. And then those waters spill out onto what was the lake bed of Glacier Lake Agassiz, developing then these large expansive floods that are so characteristic of the Red River Valley. And so we think about the characteristics of a flood on the Red River of the north. Comparing it to other rivers in the world, most rivers in the world, floods occur and they occur almost immediately as a response of rapid rainfall or whatever. Here in the Red River Valley, floods tend to be highly predictable, and they tend to be floods that are associated with snowmelt during the springtime. And so depending on snow conditions, then we might get a snowpack down in the southern valley that'll hold a lot of frozen water. And the matter then is how fast is that water going to be released? And so when the water is released, the Red River is then given the task of processing that water. All rivers are given the task of processing floodwaters, and so here's this little river with its shallow valley that is to receive these floodwaters. These floodwaters then may quickly spill out onto the lake plain of the Red River Valley itself, and they'll occupy an expansive area. These floods then, while airily large in there, also are slow flowing because they're flowing across a flat land surface. And the water sort of creeps its way towards the north over a wide swath of area, so that any little obstacle in the path of this movement of waters in here tends to deflect the waters one way or another way in here. And so we think about bridges, we think about dikes, we think about buildings, we think about section roads in here, and all these have an influence then on how the water is processed during a Red River flood.
How do we work together to advocate, celebrate, and invest in a river when its safety is questioned and it's also a challenge because it naturally floods? We can look to our city's response from notable floods like 1997 and 2009 to see how response measures have changed and how the community became involved in this process.
Well, my name is Jim Prochniak, and I serve as the Cass County Emergency Manager. I've been in this role for 6 years as the emergency manager. Prior to that, I worked more on the response side with a background in law enforcement. I retired after 28 years with the State Patrol. During the big flood events that hit the Red River Valley, namely the 97 flood and the 2009 flood, 2011 flood. What we had back in 1997, we had a lot of neighborhoods and or housing developments that were located not only within city limits, but at the outskirts of the city, very close to the Red River. Like most communities, the river is a popular location for housing, simply because of the beauty, the trees, and a little bit of different topography, and it can be a beautiful setting. However, it was just never thought of that we would flood to the extent that we did in 1997. As the water level increased, there were a lot of different sandbag operations for private residences. The problem that we faced in 97, or that was kind of a big obstacle, sandbag levees erected by public or homeowners without having a knowledge of how to do that can only hold back so much water. And they're certainly not designed to hold back water for an extended period. So we started to lose a lot of homes. It became, just a hodgepodge for responders heading to these residences to not only try to get the people out of those properties, but for those that didn't want to leave, trying to save those properties until a point where, quite frankly, whether it be volunteers or responders, it just got too risky. That winter, we had record-setting snow. We had over 114 inches of snow. We just had a perfect storm, literally, in the sense of how it melted. And in the previous fall, we had good moisture, so the ground was already wet, and it led to conditions, like I said, that nobody has ever experienced and nobody would even fathom. So they're going, yeah, it's not going to happen in my backyard, literally. It did. Worst case scenario, when I think of that 97 flood, we were very close to losing a large part of the Fargo Moorhead area. And they eventually, some last ditch efforts and a cold weather front kind of came in. We were able to shore up some of these sand dike levees with increased hauling of dirt and response efforts. 2009 was a whole new monster, and quite frankly, when you look back at it, it's pretty amazing how we were able to survive that. Yet we did. Both floods took such a volunteer effort. We don't have lakes around the Red River Valley, and so there's not natural drain sites where we could maybe put it into lakes or a chain of lakes or anything like that. When we look back, our political leaders realized we can only go to the well so many times and hold back floodwaters. After the 2009 flood, using information from the 97 and the 2009 flood, started to take shape that we need something permanent when it comes to protection. What we call the FM Diversion Project, which will be located on the North Dakota side of the Red River, has finally received approval to move forward. You can about imagine a project of this size. There's examples where it'll be anywhere from 2.5 to $3 billion by the time this is done, creating essentially a canal that captures the water as far south of Fargo, 10 to 15 miles, and diverts it west, northwest, and then feeds it back into the Red River several miles north of Fargo. Literally, what we had to do was rely on a lot of those buyouts, and then obviously a man-made canal that'll eventually route that water somewhere else.
The Fargo-Moorhead area has worked together to overcome flooding challenges, while at the same time there's been a lot of invested people and organizations encouraging people to use the river safely and promote it. All of these efforts have improved our relationship with the Red. We not only see an investment in natural capital, but other capitals as well. We're going to hear from Riverkeepers, a nonprofit that's been advocating for the Red River since 1990.
I'm Christine Holland. I'm the Executive Director of Riverkeepers, which is a nonprofit organization in Fargo-Moorhead that advocates for safe and sustainable use of the Red River. Riverkeepers was started when a group of citizens got together and decided they wanted to unite the two communities instead of divide them. So they invited the Regional Urban Design Assistance Team to come in. They canoed the Red River, they had public meetings, they met with city leaders, and they came up with a whole book of suggestions, and one of them was to have an organization speak for the river. When Riverkeepers first started, we started bringing people to the river with festivals and realized that they were still scared of the river, they didn't understand the Red River, and they weren't using it at any other time. So we switched our focus to education and outreach so that they could understand it and better safely use it. We try to engage people in all of our activities. We like them to get dirty, wet, or sweaty so that they remember the experience a little bit better. We try to meet them where their interests lie. So if they're interested in sustainability, we have a lot of projects such as how to make your own rain barrel, how to make your own compost tumbler. There's lots of tree planting opportunities, storm drain marking opportunities, cleanups, and then maybe they'll be interested in doing some more recreation stuff after they've first connected with us, and vice versa. If they're interested in recreation, we have lots of opportunities from paddling excursions to rentals to youth fishing clinics, and then hopefully they'll be interested in more of the sustainability aspect of the river. One of the first projects we started working on was cleanup projects along the Red River. So we partnered with both the park districts and lots of volunteers, and we used to find things like washing machines, dryers, cars, carpet. Now mostly we find food and beverage containers. We think that's in part because once the area is cleaned up, it really discourages other people from littering. It also makes it a lot more aesthetically pleasing, so there's more people down there just really enjoying the river, having picnics or walking along it.
While Riverkeepers has worked to get the community involved in taking care of the Red River, we've also done work to bring back recreation that's been missing for decades.
One of the reasons people quit using the Red River is because the dams had a dangerous undertow in them. So we worked with a lot of organizations to put in a 5% rock slopeway, which has made it much safer for people to use. With the retrofits of the Lowhead dams being a lot safer for people, then we were able to focus on bringing people to the Red River for recreational activities such as Race the Red and the Millennium Tour. Race the Red is a canoe and kayak race where we get about 80 vessels to go on the river, and people are out there having fun together. They get to see that there's no dangerous undertows and that the water quality is good. In 2000, we worked with people up and down the whole Red River to have a Millennium Tour, which is where one person paddled the entire length, and we had lots of other people come in and out and paddle for a half a day or 2 days or 2 weeks, whatever they had time for. And we had mayoral proclamations and community celebrations at all the cities along the Red River. And it really showed the Minnesota legislature that everybody along the whole river wanted to have a state water trail. So we were able to get it designated as a state water trail, which then led to a master plan and maps and made it easier to get more access sites on the Red River. We have been able to take city leaders out onto the river in a pontoon, canoes and kayaks, and also fishing. And so once they're out there and they're enjoying it and seeing other people enjoying it, it gets a little bit easier to have them be able to do some improvements along the Red River, such as pedestrian bridges, boat ramps, and canoe and kayak launches. With all of the engaging activities that we've been doing, it's really made residents start asking the cities and the counties to prioritize the Red River and its riverfront in their comp plans and strategic plans.
By investing in natural capital, we've also invested in other capitals like cultural and social. Despite challenges from seasonal flooding and issues with dam safety, we now have a better future because more people develop with the river in mind, use it safely, and value it as a vital part of our community.